Hey, so a couple of things before starting into physics stuff. Problem set 2 was due just now. A number of you have had complications with it, and I've also been talking with people about the questions. There are a number of imperfect questions, ones that have a best answer and a tolerable answer, or one that's not. It's incorrect, but for reasons that are just too complicated. That was never my intention, to play challenging, to make the questions misleading, for example. So please bear with the flaws in those questions. In the best of all possible worlds, I'll sit down with the entire collection and edit it. I mean, a lot of them were written by people other than me. And I know, well, we can see that I'm very careful writing my own questions. It's the hardest thing I do, in effect. I hate doing it. The exam questions I write myself from entirely. And if you look at the exam questions that are in fact posted on the website from all years of old exams, you'll see that they're much more careful. I think you'll see they're much more carefully written. They're not perfect. Sometimes I screw up. Sometimes I use words that are unfamiliar, particularly to people for whom English is not native language. I try not to do that. What else? I reinvent my own questions over and over again by accident, often suffering for an hour over a question that I wrote better 3 years ago. Anyway, ultimately, the homework assignments, the purpose of them really is to force you to pay attention to the material in a somewhat timely manner. Yeah, you all see them as graded items too, and that provides the necessary short-term motivation to get the job done. But the exams are far more important, finally, than the homework assignments. Most of the homework assignment scores lump in the vicinity of 80%. Historically, that's been the case. And they don't have a big effect on your semester grades as a result, so everybody's the same. But they're great preparation for the exam. I also encourage you to take the old exams in advance of the real ones. We do have a real one coming up September 26th, first the midterms. And I encourage you to take one of the old midterms. Don't just look at the answers. It's a completely different experience. You go, oh yeah, I knew that. Oh yeah, I knew that. Oh yeah, I knew that. It's not the same as facing the question and having to figure out the answer yourself. So take the old exams. You'll see how I ask. You'll see my style of questions for sure. You'll see, you'll actually probably learn some questions that I will ultimately ask on the exam, because I repeat myself either by stealing old questions or by reinventing the same one, that sort of thing. So purpose of this current harangue is to apologize for the imperfections of problem set 1 and to bear with the minor screw-ups and their issues about people going past a question and not answering it. I mean, I'm not sure that some of these things are fixable, but they're such small pieces of the grade that finally they're in the noise part of the grade. They don't really have much influence. It's not worth suffering over them. About Orion, I'm no longer assigning it at present. Because that boxes us in. If you simply do Orion, which I encourage you to do, you get the whole learning experience. You perhaps don't have the same obvious grade pressure to motivate you to do it, but the purpose of doing it is to face the problems, learn the stuff, and be prepared for the exams. So you can find Orion without me assigning it, play with it. You can go into chapter 2 of the textbook, you'll see Orion there for chapter 2 as a tab. And there you can play with it there. Same with chapter 3, which we're about to enter right now. Questions about problem sets, Orion, the oncoming exam. I should say, yeah, the exam coming up will be 30 questions. This is how I've been doing it for several years since I went from 1 midterm exam to 2. So there'll be 30 questions. They're all multiple choice, 4 answers. If you just guess, you get about a 25%. The average scores in these exams have historically been vicinity of 70%, give or take. That is very few people, but there are some who basically get every question. And there are some, a small number who basically do the same as guessing. And across the swath in between, centering around 70-ish. Sometimes it's in the mid-60s. Sometimes it's a little above 70. Perfection is unlikely, and don't kick yourself if you miss a question. The value of having exams that are hard enough that every question counts, and that the average is in sort of the 70 ranges, that making a minor mistake doesn't matter. One question here or there is unimportant. In the exams where the average grade is a 93, one mistake and you drop out of the average. You plummet down into the great unknown. So it's okay to have a 70s average. This is all right. If you get that, you're in the thick of things. It's good. Okay? Yeah. Do I curve? In general, I only put all the items in numerically into the final calculation, and at the end of the semester, the last thing I do is I take the numerical result and, in effect, curve it. I place class average in the spread. I have two adjustable parameters, and bang, everything all pops out. Because of the chaos with problem set 1 and Orion 1, those will be handled separately, so in effect you can say they're curved, basically to sort of everybody did great. All right. Yeah. Is it just conceptual? Essentially, yes, just conceptual. There are probably two things I can think of that I want you to know in the way of sort of formulas, like how to do work. That when you do work, by exerting a force on something and having it move a distance in the direction of the force, and the amount of work you do is the product of the force times the distance. I mean, if you know that as a formula, great. If you understand it as a concept, better still. But that you should be able to, in effect, calculate. And Newton's second law, that if you exert a force on something and it has a mass, certain mass, its acceleration will be exactly the force divided by the mass. Is that okay? The other stuff, like the position as a function of time for a falling ball, don't try to memorize that. It's in the book, and I give a little attention to it, but you'll never remember it 10 years from now. You never remember it, next year. It's not worth trying to memorize, and I would not ask you to regurgitate it in any way. Other questions? Yeah. What about knowing the weight based on the slope of a ramp? In the sense of being a formula, no, I wouldn't expect you to know that. But to be able to sort of logic out, think out, that, gee, this ramp is twice as steep, in effect, as that one, meaning that to get to the top of the hill along this ramp, you travel twice as far as this ramp? Or this is the shallow one. Is there a difference in the force between the two? See, pushing somebody up those ramps? Sure there is. How does it differ? Well, you ought to be able to think through at this point that pushing a kid in a wagon, say, up the long ramp involves a 10 Newton force. Pushing that kid up the short ramp at constant velocity, it's half the length of the long ramp. You're going to have to push twice as hard. You ought to be able to tell me that it's actually a factor of 2 larger in force. There will rarely be questions in which the answer is a number. Involves a number, except for my favorite number, which is 0. So answers that look like 23 joules, very unlikely to show up on the exam. Almost never. Answers that have an exact value that has words in it often do show up. For example, what force is the ground exerting on me right now? You can tell me with exact accuracy. It's an upward force, right? Because it's supporting me, and it's balancing away my weight. I'm not accelerating, so you know exactly how hard it's pushing on me. The upward force is exactly equal in amount to my weight, but upward. No number showed up in that answer, but it's accurate to every digit. Okay? And I love questions that have answers like that, in a sense that, they're more interesting than a number like 17. The questions where the answer is 17, they're so easy to write, and they're really boring typically, and they just sort of go by. It's I don't know, it's like eating, I can't think what food it is that you eat that you're hungry next, pick your choice. It provides no sustenance. All right? Other questions? Yeah. In this case, me on the floor, the net force on me is what? 0. And you know that because I'm not accelerating. So you also know that there are two individual forces acting on me. One is my weight downward, that's gravity pulling me down, the Earth's gravity. And the other is the floor, so the floor has to cancel it. So the two forces together sum to 0, but the force the ground is exerting on me, that's equal in amount to my weight, but in the opposite direction. Other things? Okay. For odds and ends that I feel like I wanted to bring up that are sort of in our past a little bit, or I left behind. One, just for fun, I remembered during office hours this morning with people that years ago I got, they're alternately called Diablos or Chinese yo-yos, and you guys had a yo-yo question. The way these guys work, and I was never skilled, and I'm certainly not skilled, having ignored this thing for years. The point is, I ought to be able to get it spinning up to speed. It is an object that I can get rotating if I pay attention to doing it right. And I'm causing angular acceleration occasionally by pulling the string into hard contact with the central axle and pulling harder on one arm than the other, and therefore exerting a force, a frictional force, along the string acting on that axle. Basically, I'm getting the axle, I'm twisting the axle with the string, and gradually bringing the thing up to substantial rotational angular velocity. You can see it spinning pretty well now, I hope. What else about this? So I'm using and all things that can go wrong. Of course, if I were skilled, I'd be tossing it in the air and catching it behind my back. So you can imagine that I am, and I'll take credit for it. So the point is, repeated exertions of a torque by way of friction on that axle gradually got it spinning faster. And we could think of that in terms of a torque causing angular acceleration, or in terms of an angular impulse investing angular momentum in it. So it was accumulating angular momentum in a certain direction. It was rotating in a certain way. A reason for bringing this up was because one of the questions on the homework involved a yo-yo with its central little axle and a string on it, which is basically the same story here. A string near an axle and that is sliding along that axle can exert a torque on the object. How? That frictional force of the string sliding along that axle, or trying to slide, is a force exerted at a small but non-zero lever arm from the actual center of rotation. So if you zoomed in like crazy on that axle, you discover that there's the central pivot where it's actually spinning around. The axle is big compared to that now in my zoomed in view, and the string is pushing along the side and therefore twisting the axle about that central pivot, exerting a torque on it. There's a lever arm and a force that's perpendicular to the lever arm, everything you need to create a torque and to get it spinning. And if I stop trying to make it spin faster and rather just support it, it will slow to a stop because, I got to get it untangled there. It will slow to a stop because it'll again, the string will again exert a torque on the axle, but in the way that slows it down. So I'm working hard to exert the torque in the direction that speeds it up and invests angular momentum in it. It now has lots of angular momentum in it, essentially toward me. If you play a right-hand rule, you'll discover that it's spinning in the toward me direction. If I now stop, the string is going to suck the angular momentum out of it. It's exerting a torque on it in the wrong direction, and it came to a stop and then fell over. All right? I mean, it's just an example. You can use the things we've been talking about on semi-everyday objects to explain their behaviors. Is that okay? Any questions? You could write, I could teach a class about that little object, but it's not worth it right now. So I'll stop. So that's one item to go back to. Second item to go back to, actually more important. We saw with momentum. Momentum is a conserved quantity of moving, of going somewhere. And a couple pieces to sort of watching the transfers. First off, I'm going to get some momentum toward the right. To do that, I have to be given it by something else that has it. Otherwise, I can't obtain any. It's a conserved quantity. I can't create rightward momentum. So I'm going to get it from the floor. How to do that? I'm going to push the floor to your left with a frictional force in my shoes. When I do that, here you go, ready? Push. Oh, look at that. The floor pushed me back to the right. I pushed the floor to the left. It pushed me to the right. It did it for a time. End of story for a moment. It did it for time and therefore gave me momentum to the right. It did an impulse on me. Force times time. All right, so far? So I can get up to speed quickly with a big force for a short time, or slowly with a small force for a long time. The product of the two, force times time, is the same, assuming I started with no momentum and I ended up with 6 units to the right. If that was the overall transaction, I went from 0 to 6 to the right, something gave me 6 units. And that came by way of an impulse, which is a force times the time. And we don't care. We'll care in a minute. Was it a big force for a little time, or a little force for a big time, or something in between? Any pairing that gives you a total of 6 units to the right, that is good enough. So I'll show you why we'll care in a minute. I want to show you one other thing with this. And that is, I'm going to get myself 6 units. I'm making this up, of course. 6 units to the right. I'm going to carry them with me. I'm going to give them all to the wall. Boosh, there I did. I gave every last one of those 6 units of momentum to the right, to the wall. And I ended up with none. I'm stopped. But let me try another version of the same story, almost. I'll push back on the ground. Oh, 6 units again. I go over and I'm going to give 6 units to the wall, and I'm going to keep giving. Oh, I now have 6 units, well, to be different, 7 units of momentum to the left now. How many did I give to the wall? I started with 6 to the right, and I ended with 7 to the left. How many units? What did I give to the wall? I actually gave it, well, we can always say it's a positive amount, but we have to choose our direction. So a positive amount of momentum to the right is the same as a negative amount to the left. So I give we'll think in terms of giving a positive amount of something to the wall. Did I give it 1 unit, which seems sensible because we went from 6 to 7? Or did I give it -1, which is tempting? Or did I give it 13 units to the right? I gave it 13 units to the right. I gave it more momentum, seemingly, than I had. And this, you think, well, what, who cares? And this is what happens during a bounce. Bouncing objects typically don't come back traveling faster than they went in, but let me just make it simple and go. So I'll go 6 units to the right in, perfect bounce, 6 units to the left coming out. In that transaction with the wall, I gave it first 6 units to the right as I came to a stop, and then I gave it another 6 units to the right as I rebounded. I gave it a total of 12 units of momentum to the right. And the result is my momentum changed by 12 units, from 6 to the right to 6 to the left. That's a 12-unit change, because direction is important. And so where would this ever matter? Well, it matters in things like, suppose that's the door to something you want to break into. This is, criminology 101, or no, I guess that's the working against crime. Okay, whatever. Okay, you want to knock the door down. The physics of knocking a door down is you want to pour momentum into the door so fast that nothing supporting the door can take it out speedily enough to prevent the door from accumulating momentum and beginning to move. So if I go and I push on the door gently, or basically gently, I'm investing momentum into it as I push. The amount I'm investing is the force I exert times the time I exert it, but it's going in a little at a time. And this door is managing to spread it out and pass it off to the floor, the ceiling, the various other parts of the building rapidly enough that it never accumulates any and it doesn't begin to move. But if I go and I bang into it, I invest momentum into it so fast it can't help but start to move. It's trying to get rid of the momentum by pushing on other things. But if you swamp its ability to transfer the momentum away, it will move. And one of the tricks, one of the physics tricks to really swamping an object's ability to absorb the momentum is to not just hit it, but to bounce off of it. Because bouncing involves transfer during the stopping process and a continuing transfer in the rebounding process. So battering rams and stuff don't just have like a bag of sand as the impact device. Sand doesn't bounce. So when it hits, it just stops. A beanbag goes thunk. Sandbag goes thunk. Put a rubber ball there. So it hits and it bounces. Because the bounce is just as effective at transferring momentum to the thing you're hitting as the initial impact. So I've told some of you guys, state fairs, the fairs where you go and you try to win the big stuffed animals that are badly made and burst in your house and spill little styrofoam beads around anyway. If you want to win them anyway, you're facing lots of physics that's set up, games that are set up against you by physics. Things like get the basketball to stop in the basket. You've seen the ones where they got like a bushel basket or something here against a rigid wall, and you have to get the ball to land in the basket and stay there, not bounce out. Well, the ball can't do any work on anything here. It won't move. So the ball comes in, hits, and it's full of energy, and it bounces, and it can't get rid of its energy, and it won't stop, and you essentially always lose unless you're really amazingly good and lucky. Or plates that are all over the place, or glass bottles where you throw coins, or rigid plastic rings, things that bounce like crazy. They can't get rid of their energy. They can't stop. The coins hit, bounce, and they won't stay on the plates. The rings won't stay on the bottles. These are, I hope, are familiar games. You've seen these at amusement parks too. And then there are the ones where you got to knock stuff off the shelf with objects, projectiles, you throw them. Well, if they give you the choice between a beanbag, which doesn't bounce, and a rubber ball of the same mass, these two will go off towards that, I don't know, milk jug or something, with equal momenta. Same mass, same velocity. If you throw them together, whoosh, off they go with the same momentum. Whoosh! The one that doesn't bounce will hit, give up all its momentum, and stop. The one that bounces, though, will hit, give up all its momentum, and then keep giving momentum as it bounces back. And it's more effective at knocking stuff over. Potentially twice as effective. If it bounces perfectly, it transfers twice as much momentum as it came in with. Okay? So, one more piece that, hey, we're majoring in review in old material. Transfers of momentum, as I've talked about, they're impulses. That is how you transfer momentum from one thing to another. And you can transfer that momentum with different arrangements of force and time. So, for example, if you're walking along in the dark because somebody turned out the light or it burned out, and you're desperate for the last piece of cake, and you know it's in the refrigerator, and you're walking along, and bang, you hit the wall. What happened? You went from, at the start of the story, you had 3 units of momentum toward the wall. At the end of the story, let's assume no bounce. People don't bounce very well, which is another story, but okay. 0 momentum. You went from 3 to 0. You transferred 3 units of momentum toward the wall to the wall. The question is, how fast did you transfer it, and therefore how big were the forces involved? If you hit the bare, concrete wall, the impact might have lasted 100th of a second and involved forces that send you off to the student health. Boom, huge force for 100th of a second, bad news. But if, I don't know, the wall was decorated with you've got a designer for a roommate, and they have all their ball gowns posted up along the wall, and you hit the ball gown, push. It's a slow bounce. It took a second. The forces involved, because you got 100 times as much time to transfer the momentum, the forces involved are only 1/100th as large. Is that understandable? Or questions about that? We go through life trying to avoid sudden transfers of momentum. To distill life down to its basic issues. Rapid transfers of momentum hurt. They typically involve big forces. So we try to transfer momentum with small forces. Hit the padding. Steering wheels. They used to be just hard, steel. 20, 50, 100 years ago, they were just or wood. They were just hard as nails, and hitting those and transferring all your momentum to them in the process of stopping suddenly during an accident was terrible. What's the alternative? Blow up a cushion between you and the steering wheel, so-called airbag. And now you stop 100 times slower, and the forces involved are much smaller. To spill it out, to flesh it out completely, car accidents in which a car goes from traveling fast to motionless, and there are plenty of scenarios in which that sort of thing happens. The issue is you're coasting forward, you are carrying your own personal supply of momentum. You got to give it up in order to stop with the car. What are you going to give it up to? Giving up to the steering wheel is a lousy choice. You give it up too fast, and therefore with a big force. If you do it instead of an airbag, you give it up much more slowly with a much smaller force. And beginning and end is the same. You start with a lot of forward momentum. You end up with no momentum, assuming no bounce. And in between, you want the slow transfers. You also don't want the bounce. If it's you don't want to bounce off the airbag because it hurts just as much to be kicked back as it does to go forward. So the airbag actually deliberately sort of gives, it yields. It tries not to bounce you. It tries to just catch you and stop. The demonstration for this, okay, now I've talked the bejeebers out of the story. I have 2 baseballs. This is an official league baseball, so basically it's relatively close to what's used at a major league ballpark and things related. This is a soft strike ball, so it's a slightly softer surface version of this. So this is what this is official. Alas, Little League uses balls like this too. This is a little softer. They have the same mass. They feel pretty nearly the same in many ways. But this one transfers its momentum faster than this one. So can I have a person help me here and pound nails in with these guys? Daniela? So here, I'll first, it's the right ball. Okay. So you can pound a nail in. This is the league hardball. Yeah. Try again. See if can you actually sink the. You should be able to sink the nail into. She's making progress. I mean, the nail went down at least a quarter of an inch at this point into the wood, because the transfer the idea is the transfer momentum is so fast from the ball was heading down to stopped or maybe even rebounding in 1,000th of a second. It transfers all its momentum to the nail in 1,000th of a second, and that involves a huge force enough to shove it into the wood. And that's what's an alternative to this. This is the soft one. You can't, if you be gentle, you can hit my hand, just not too hard, right? Yeah, you can go a little more than that, but still, this is okay. That one, not so much, right? It doesn't hurt. This one, try that one a little and just feel what it feels like, right? It's horrendously worse. Yeah. As another alternative, you want to try. This is a hockey puck. This is an official hockey puck. You can do the same thing. It's also. Thanks. So you guys can feel free to come up in here and try pounding nails. The issue is, okay, these are toys, or in effect, they're parts of games. And we're hammering a nail. What if that's you? And it happens. Like you. No one's going to realistically stand there and have someone come up here and go like thwack like that, right? But they're willing to let someone throw these suckers at them at 100 miles an hour or close, and that's way worse. So there are serious injuries that come from people being hit by these. Basically, they're flying hammers. They are so hard, they transfer all their momentum so fast that they're seriously dangerous. Yeah, they're dangerous, right? Sorry, bad taste. Bottom line is be careful with these things. When they're traveling fast, the hard ones transfer their momentum so fast that ultimately people get killed by them. And particularly for little kids and stuff. I used to show pictures of one of our good friends whose two sons. One son was a pitcher, actually at VMI, and the other son was the obstacle that the fastball hit right here. And the before and after pictures of his eye gradually recovering were pretty horrific. So he's fine, but it was really nasty. So for kids playing baseball, I would encourage you all to pay attention to the balls they're playing with. And if it's possible to play with a ball that has a slightly softer surface, what are known as reduced impact force balls. They're almost hard to tell from the real thing, from the league ball. But that peak impact force is reduced, and they're just less of a flying hammer. Okay? Public service announcement. But this also shows you how hammers work. You get the hammer moving, you then, a steel hammer, a real, one for pounding nails in, you get it moving, then you allow it to transfer all its momentum very fast. And it will push things super hard enough to punch a nail into a piece of wood or break rocks, whatever you like. All right? Same with an axe. Last thing to talk about. So, okay, I've talked about transfers of momentum. The one last piece I wanted to talk about, left over from bumper cars. And this is actually, I can do a thesis on this little object. So it's just a giant pendulum. It's a bowling ball hanging from a string, and things about it. One is, right now, the bowling ball has settled about as low as it can go. It's directly below its support on this string. It can't go any lower than this, so this is as little gravitational potential energy as it can have. It's also motionless, so this is as little kinetic energy as it has. But I can take it away from the current position or speed it up, and in either case, I will be adding energy to it. So I am going to push it away from this happy location, which incidentally is equilibrium. I've used that word before. Is it equilibrium, meaning that it's experiencing zero net force? I'm going to push it away from equilibrium, and that's an action that requires work. So I'm going to push on it for a distance, and then I'm going to invest energy into it. And you notice it's getting higher, right? It's coming up higher and higher. So its gravitational potential energy is increasing as a result of this. If I push a little faster, I can make its kinetic energy increase instead of gravitational, or along with gravitational. But basically, I can invest the energy, and now I can let it swing back and forth, and it will all by itself spontaneously convert gravitational potential energy to kinetic, to gravitational, to kinetic, to gravitational, to kinetic, to gravitational, back and forth. And this is it universal? It's extremely common, if not universal, in things that undergo these periodic motions, which could be called in general oscillatory or vibrational motions. This guy's going back and forth. It's rhythmically converting its energy between two different forms, gravitational, kinetic, gravitational, kinetic, gravitational, kinetic. Is that okay with everybody, the conversion? Back and forth? So, one more thing to do this before I need another volunteer. Ha ha. It's fine. Okay. To point out that I can put energy into this two different ways by doing work. I can get the energy into it with one big push, short time, big force, it's all in. Or I can rhythmically push this thing. We'll deal with this story late in the semester. Hopefully I'll get there. When you push something on a swing, or when I'm always doing work on it. If I want it to swing harder and harder, I have to keep doing work on it. I keep pushing it as it moves away from me. Right? Away. Force and movement are in the same direction. I push it away from me, it moves away from me. If I push it away from me as it moves toward me, I suck the energy out. I do negative work on it. Right? This is how you slow someone down. The point of showing you this all is it's all the stuff I've been telling you is real and correct. You really, it's really working. You really invest the energy into it by doing work on it, and you take the energy out by doing negative work on it. Okay? Last part of this demonstration, or story, somebody who really believes in the conservation of energy to come up here and stand against the wall with the ball. Okay, somebody? Allie again. Okay. Brave, confident in physics. So your job is to hold this against your chin or forehead, wherever it comes up against, with your head against the wall, and in a moment to let go of it, but do not push, because you do not want to invest any more energy in it than it already has. So you simply let go. Gravitational, kinetic, gravitational. Well done, though. Yeah. Thanks. It can't go any higher because it doesn't have the energy to go higher and farther from center. Had she pushed it, or had there been an earthquake during the moment that did work on it by way of the top, then all bets are off, right? And over the years, we've repaved basically that part of the wall occasionally after somebody does give it a push. No one's actually been punched through the wall, but the ball has hit the wall hard a couple times and left marks. You all okay with why that worked? Yeah. Why couldn't it be inertial and just keep going? Well, it's not inertial in the sense that it's always got forces acting on it throughout this entire swing. At this point, it's basically riding what behaves like a ramp downhill here. And so it's experiencing almost a ramp force down. So it accelerates down this thing. At the bottom, you would think it's inertial. It's actually not, but that's a complicated story. But it overshoots. This is the equilibrium, at least at rest. It overshoots, and now it's experiencing a force back towards center. It keeps getting pushed back towards center by a combination of forces resembling a ramp. It's not a ramp because there's nothing under it. The string is playing the role of the ramp, and it's a funny ramp because the ramp gets steeper as you go farther from center. Is that helpful? Yeah.
Is it slowing down because of thermal due to friction?
Is it slowing down because of thermal, because of friction? The answer is that point up there doesn't move. There's very little waste of energy. There's very little work going on up there. There's very little work going on anywhere here. It's the energy is really trapped in this device, this pendulum. The only way it's losing energy significantly is air resistance. So if we took the air out of the room, this thing would go for hours. Just because it's fun, I will let this thing start. It'll be going at the end of class.
So that's more than
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. This will swing for hours, and there are museums. You've probably seen at museums a type of pendulum known as a Foucault pendulum that tries to swing back and forth, and its reason for being is that as the Earth rotates, the motion of the pendulum has an interesting evolution relative to the ground. It's too complicated to discuss here, but it does seem to shift relative to the ground, and you can knock pins over every hour, for example. Have you seen pendulum like this? The reality is, making a pendulum that works in the open air and will swing for an entire day is just about, you can't do it. You can come close, but you can't do it. So they have to have gimmicks, like they have electromagnets and stuff that give the pendulum a little pull as it comes close to keep it going. Because you can get it to go for a couple hours, but getting it to go an entire day in the air is too much. There are ones that operate in vacuum, but that's like, now you can't just have, kids can't play around it unless you put them in moon suits. All right? Any other questions? All right. A reason I brought this up, apart from the fun and games of the conversion of energy from one form to another, is it also illustrates a general rule that's useful to us, and that is, up until now I've talked about objects accelerating in the direction of the force acting on them, that if there's a force acting in this direction on my keys will accelerate in the direction of the force, and the amount of that acceleration will be the force divided by the mass of the keys. That was the story so far, hopefully familiar. Sometimes identifying all the forces is just hard, and you can't do it. And here's a case in point. It's not easy to figure out what all the forces are acting on that bowling ball at any given moment. It's got gravity, it's got the string pulling up on it. The string has a little bit of a stretchy character to it. How does that influence things? Well, there is a general rule that describes the acceleration of an object without explicitly talking about forces. And it's this, that if you look at all the potential energies that an object has available to it, gravitational potential energy, elastic potential energy, say in that string, maybe some potential energies that are in the bowling ball's structure itself, it might be a little bit rubbery, and so on, elastic. If you add them all up and you figure out how they change if you let the thing move from here to there, or here to there, or here to there, or here to there, map out all the ways in which it the total potential energy changes with position, the object or the system will accelerate in the direction that reduces that total potential energy as quickly as possible. It tries to get rid of potential energy. And you can see it here. When the ball is up toward me, most of its potential energy, I should say, is gravitational. And when it gets up here, the direction in which it can get rid of its total potential energy as quickly as possible is by going back towards center. When it's over here, it can get rid of its total potential energy by going back towards center. And if it were, you pull it any way you like, it's going to always act to accelerate so as to get rid of its total potential energy as quickly as it can. It's basically going down what's known as a gradient in potential energy. It's trying to go downhill in energy. And that will just simply prove useful for complicated systems where we just can't figure out all the forces. We just want to go, well, it's chock full of energy. You've got springs wound and all that. Which way is it going to go when you let go? It'll try to get rid of energy, potential energy. Okay? All right, with that long story. Spring scales. Now, so we're shifting sort of from the world. Yeah. I've got 5 minutes left. Well, thank you very much. The issue here is we're going to start to apply some of these laws we've encountered before, rules and concepts. And spring scales is one that I've actually sort of wandered across bits and pieces already because I just did, because it's interesting to me anyway. And we'll figure out how they work. Spring scales of my growing up were like this one. I don't know if you can see there's a dial in it. And if I squeeze the scale, I can make the dial move. I'm pretty sure it's moving fine. The ones you're probably used to have no dial anymore. They'll read out in digits. But this one contains a spring, and the one that has digits also has a spring. The real difference is that this one tells you how much distortion its spring has undergone using a dial, whereas the modern ones tell you how much the spring has undergone distortion with digits. It's using electronic. Otherwise, they're using the same physical concept. That is that a spring has a beautiful relationship between its deformation and the forces acting on its parts. So we'll get there shortly. And as a preview for this, if you look at a springboard at the, some swimming pool, a springboard's its reason for being is so that when you get to the end, you can sort of bounce up and down. You are standing on a spring, and this is it's part of. I never got comfortable going off springboards. For me, they were just glorified platforms that I tried not to bounce. But here's a springboard for, I don't have a pet mouse, but pet mouse would be, okay, right? So this is a spring. And actually a stick like this has all the characteristics, except for the shape, of these more conventional springs. If you talk about spring, I mean, other than like spring water, which I'm not talking about, this is the classic coil spring. These ones are designed primarily to be squeezed. This one's designed primarily to be stretched. But those are the classic springs. But this has many of the same characteristics, this springboard. And so the question is this. A diver walks out of the springboard and stands motionless at the end. And in the result, the springboard bends downward slightly. Believe it or not, it happens. You can watch it happen. And now her identical twin comes walking out and stands next to her. So now there are two identical people standing next to each other. How far downward will the board bend when the second twin arrives? So the first twin arrived, settled, the board bent downward that far, let's say. The second twin arrives, lets the board settle. How far is it bent down now? You okay with the question? And the answers, this is a case where I try to be explicit in answers so that we don't get these ambiguities that showed up in the problem set this go around. How many think that the board bends downward the same amount as with only one diver on it? That is, the second diver has no effect on the board's bend. Okay? How many think that the board will be bent down twice as far with the two divers on it as it was with one diver on it? How many think C, 4 times as far with two divers? Okay, the vast majority are going for twice. Two divers causes twice the bend, and that is the correct answer. And the reason for this, the reason for this actually has to do with the structures of these materials and the interactions that lead to them acting as a spring, so it's kind of complicated. But the observation about springs, and there are thousands of things that act as springs, and I'll justify that statement next time. The major characteristics of springs are that when you bend them away from the shape they prefer, what I call their equilibrium shape, forces appear that try to return the parts to where they were, try to return them to equilibrium. And those forces are proportional to how far you bend them away from their equilibrium shape. So if you bend the board 1 inch away from equilibrium, it summons up 1 unit, say 1 pound of force. If you bend it 2 inches away from equilibrium, it summons up 2 units of force, 2 pounds, say. 3 units of distance, 3 units of force. Go the other direction, you go up 1 inch, and now you get 1 pound of force the other direction. It's always trying to go back to equilibrium. But that proportionality is beautifully held by most springs. It's right on, so that you can relate the distortion of a spring to how hard it's pushing almost perfectly, up until you go too far. And you've all encountered this case where you take the spring too far, or something that's equivalent to a spring too far, and it breaks or bends permanently. You ruin the spring. up until that, what's called the elastic limit, you get this beautiful relationship, one-to-one proportionality between distortion and force. And that's what ultimately allows spring scales to work so nicely. And we'll finish that part on Friday.